Hi, back again with Social Studies 30-1. Just going to look at some further specific examples of illiberalism. So far, we've looked at the War Measures Act, leading to the internment of the Ukrainian Canadians, the Japanese Canadians. We examined anti-terrorist legislation like 9/11 and so on. I just want to give you a bit more fodder evidence to evaluate illiberalism and democracy. We'll look at some further examples here right now, and this shouldn't take too long. I quickly wanted to talk about Guantanamo Bay Detention Center, or the Guantanamo Bay Prison. It's another good example of an illiberalist measure by a democracy. You need a little bit of history. If we were to go back to the 1800s, and even before that, the island of Cuba in the Caribbean, the biggest island in the Caribbean, was actually a Spanish colony. And you probably know that. But what most people don't know is that in the late 1800s, Cuba, in a revolution, overthrew Spanish rule and got its independence. What a lot of people don't know as well is that the American government was also involved and helped out Cuba overthrow the Spanish and gain Cuban independence. And right after that happened, America was able to use its political clout and maneuvering at that time to grab a piece of Cuba for itself and keep it. And that piece that they grabbed and kept is known as Guantanamo Bay. It was originally established as a naval base and still is an American naval base to this day. So Cuba, by and large, belongs to Cubans except for that little piece that is known as Guantanamo Bay. And it comes important now in that in order for America to circumvent the Bill of Rights and the Constitution, what they do is they send political prisoners to Guantanamo Bay Prison, Cuba. And because it's not on American soil, the prison doesn't need to abide by the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and so on. So the things that protect American citizens um, and guarantee them their rights and freedoms on American soil don't apply to Guantanamo Bay because it's not on American soil. And so it was originally established as a naval base, and then in 2001, just after 9/11, President George W. Bush uses Guantanamo Bay Prison as a prison, a holding pen to prosecute and figure out what to do with suspected 9/11 participants and any terrorist that is a threat to America from that point on. They were labeled enemy combatants and they're denied legal protection. And it's been there ever since 2001. There has been talk of closing it down on occasion. Barack Obama tried to, but he couldn't. And so as of 2019, there are still about 40 detainees. But when it originally opened, there would have been hundreds. And there are rumors of torture and psychological torture and so on. And I guess a lot of it is hard to prove. It is very expensive for America to run Guantanamo Bay. It's costing the government to the tune of $445 million a year to run these facilities. But it's an example of illiberalism in that it's the American government that runs Guantanamo Bay. And there is no doubt that prisoners would be denied basic rights and freedoms while they are in Guantanamo that they would get if they were prisoners in America. So here are pictures, some of these pictures circulated in the media for a while and still do. So again, a very strong military presence for sure. This is, after all, a prison run by the American military. Protesting back home in front of the White House. And then another photo of prisoners playing volleyball in Guantanamo Bay, which makes you wonder, is it as bad as the media has made it out to be? Well, I don't know for sure. Most people probably don't know for sure how bad it is. So it's not a big deal in terms of our look at illiberalism. It's just another specific example of a government resorting to illiberalist measures to protect its people. And the American government would contend, they would justify Guantanamo Bay by saying, listen, we're keeping these prisoners here, and we're denying them basic rights and freedoms to protect American citizens. And that's why we're doing this. We're taking away liberalism for some people to guarantee it for the majority of Americans. Now, whether or not you agree with that, is up to you. But that's how they would defend their use of the Guantanamo Bay detention center. Let's move on. Another specific example I'd like to look at is a Canadian one. And this is the case of Mayor Arar. And this is an example of what we call extraordinary rendition. Extraordinary rendition is when, you're being held prisoner in one country, but yet another country takes you from that country and prosecutes you in that new country. And so if you were a prisoner, I don't know, in America facing trial, and the Canadian government went and took you out of America and brought you back to Canada to face trial and justice, that would be extraordinary rendition. And this is the case of Mayor Arar. Syrian-born Canadian engineer. He had been traveling back and forth from Canada to Tunisia and other Middle Eastern countries too. When in September of 2002, so again, just after 9/11, post 9/11 climate, he was yanked off the plane in New York. American authorities suspected him of being involved with Al Qaeda. Al Qaeda was the terrorist organization, as you know, led by Osama bin Laden, that conducted 9/11. So Al Qaeda was a terrorist organization that conducted 9/11. They were responsible for it. The Americans believed that Arar was linked to Al Qaeda. What they did was they had become suspicious of the countries that he was vacationing to, Tunisia, Algeria, and so on. Those countries are known terrorist hotbeds. A lot of recruiting does happen in them, and the Americans believed that he was somehow linked with Al Qaeda. So they took him off a plane in New York and then deported him to Syria, his home country, to face charges and prosecution. He was held prisoner in Syria for 1 year, and he was tortured and brutalized during that 1 year. Syria is notorious for treating prisoners very harshly. He was never really given a fair trial. He came home to Canada after a year. He was let out and sued the government for $10 million dollars and got an official apology from Stephen Harper. The contention was the Canadian government should have done more to protect his rights and freedoms. They shouldn't have let the Americans pull him off the plane and ship him back to Syria. Now, again, whether you agree with that or not, is up to you. But there's another specific example of illiberalism in action. A government denying basic rights and freedoms to an individual because they suspect him of terrorism, which could threaten an entire country. There's another example of that in action. And one more. This is the case of Omar Khadr, who was when he was 15, was detained by the U.S. government at Guantanamo Bay Prison for 10 years. He pled guilty to killing a U.S. Army sergeant and other charges too. He later would appeal his conviction, though, claiming that he falsely pleaded guilty so he could come back to Canada. And he was kept in Canada when he came back for 3 additional years. He sued the government for $10.5 million dollars for infringing his rights under the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Uh, Supreme Court ruled that the interrogation of Khadr offended, Canadian standards of law, justice, and detainment. And that's why he got the lawsuit. Is that while in Guantanamo Bay, the 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 confession that he gave, was not justified because of the conditions that he gave it under. Perhaps he was being tortured. I don't know the specifics of it, but that's the reason why he got the settlement. And is that while in Guantanamo Bay, he wasn't treated fairly. He probably didn't have legal representation, and the confession was perhaps tortured or beaten out of him, which means should it really stand up in court? Um, he did come back to Canada. He served the remainder of his sentence, but did get the settlement from the government. What makes this illiberal is that while in Guantanamo Bay, he wasn't given the same legal representation and rights and freedoms as he would have in a prison in Canada or a prison in the U.S. itself, and that was an illiberal act. All right, so there you go. Three more examples, specific examples of illiberalism. These pertain to individuals in a detention center. We still have a few more to look at. We want to study the Indian Act is a very good Canadian example of illiberalism and one that we don't often think of. And probably next week we're going to examine uh, what are known as the Jim Crow laws in the southern states up until the 1960s. The Jim Crow laws basically denied black people basic rights and freedoms that everyone else got in those southern states. And so the denial of those basic rights and freedoms will lead to the American civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s that will overturn illiberalism in the American South. That's actually really interesting. You'll get a lot out of it. You'll like learning about it. But I think we'll save that till probably Tuesday next week. Okay, nice job. I'm glad you paid attention, and I hope you got something out of that too.